I'd have liked to see rigorous analysis, and we may get that analysis, that this spending's going to be incremental. For example, there's no question we should have electric charging stations across America and electric cars, but we built gas stations without the government ever paying. Does the government really need to pay as much as is contained in this bill to get electric charging stations across the country? So I think Democrats are completely right on the need for much more resources, but I think some Republicans have a point when they emphasize efficiency, when they emphasize alacrity, and when they emphasize discipline in setting the functions. But this is hugely important for our economy. This is certainly worth, in many of the areas, substantially more government borrowing.
So it's hugely important to get the money to do the investment, but it's almost as important to make sure that it gets done right, or as close to right as possible. You've worked at the top levels of government. Do we need to rethink the way our government really administers itself in this sense? When was the last time the U.S. government spent $2.25 trillion and did it the right way? Can we have a rigorous system for return on investment, which is what you do in a corporation, to say, okay, we'll invest this money, but this is what we expect back?
This should be a huge priority in the design of all of this. But of course, more extensive review can be the enemy of more alacrity, but more speed. But I think we, with the right kind of administration, can do much better. Take an area like high density power lines. The issue there is not lack of money, it's lack of regulatory approval. And we got to figure out how to get the states cooperating so each state doesn't hold up all the other states in that area. I'd like to see President Biden talking more about the importance of doing it well and acknowledging more some of the past failures. On the other hand, I think there are some who seize on the semantic issues, who seize on some of the things that weren't great, who give the Pentagon a complete pass on every failed weapons system. But if some mass transit system in an urban area doesn't work exactly right on schedule or overruns its cost, go into a state of hysteria. And that's wrong. And so I'd say to my friends in the Republican side, let's have some symmetry in what you're prepared to do with respect to military procurement and what you're insisting on in these areas.
Larry, another big story this week were the IMF meetings, the spring meetings of the IMF, and it really underscored something we're watching, which is increasing divergence around the world, both in terms of the vaccination programs as well as in the economic growth. You see it even between the United States and Europe at this point, but then when you go to the low and middle income countries, it is quite stark, both on the vaccination rate and also the economy. What can and should be done about this? This is something you've been talking about for well over a year now.
Look, what we understand better today than we did 6 months ago is that this is going to be heavily about the ways in which the virus does or does not evolve. If it stops evolving, we're going to get this problem completely under control. If it keeps evolving, it's going to become an endemic problem. And evolution happens in proportion to how much the virus is all over the world. And that means uncontrolled COVID anywhere is a big threat to people everywhere. And if you're living in Pittsburgh, you've got almost as much risk from uncontrolled COVID in Lagos as you do from COVID in Philadelphia, because a new strain will get everywhere within 3 or 4 months. And that makes it absolutely essential that we have a global vaccine effort, a global testing effort, and this is a critical point that I've been working on, we're going to have one of these things every decade or so. we're going to have a threat like this every decade or so. And we need an infrastructure to make sure that we're constantly watching and ready to stop it at its source at the beginning. And that's what we didn't have this time. You know, the economist term for it is a global public good. We've got to support the international financial institutions, especially in providing the resources that do what's necessary. My sense is that with the necessary annual costs for prevention in the $10 billion range, or maybe even less, and the cost of this in the trillions of dollars, that the single highest return investment that can be made globally is in infrastructure to prevent these from recurring. And the second highest investment we can make is in getting this thing under control.
Okay, Larry, let's wrap this up with a quick line. A lightning quick round of Summer says, start off with central bank digital currencies. Much the vogue right now. We've learned that most central banks are working on a digital currency. 5 years from now, will the Federal Reserve have its own digital currency?
I doubt it. It'll have a bunch of stuff with digital accounts, but no real digital currency.
We also heard this week from Secretary of Treasury Yellen, about coordinating with OECD on a corporate minimum tax internationally. Is that going to happen within the next year?
Bravo, and it's going to be as or more important than the next trade agreement we reach with some other country. This is the international integration issue of this moment.
For some of us living in New York, we got hit with a big new tax. If you made a lot of money in New York, you're going to pay a lot more taxes here. There's a lot of concern about that, individual stories about people moving away. But in the larger sense, do you think this might affect the economy of New York State?
You deserve to pay more taxes. It should happen. But New York City and New York State can't do it alone without substantial consequences in this environment. And I am very fearful that, particularly without federal deductibility, this is going to do a lot of damage to New York's tax base and set off a downward spiral.
And finally, Larry, the big story from last week with Archegos, the sort of implosion of Archegos. Should we expect within the near future more regulation of family offices?
I wouldn't be surprised, but even more, I'd expect more regulation of prime broker lending.
Okay, many, many thanks to our special contributor here at Wall Street Week. He is Larry Summers of Harvard. Finally, one more thought. Getting more bees with honey than with vinegar, especially if they're rich bees. This week saw a lot of talk about taxing the rich in the United States, whether they're companies.
That at least 55 of our largest corporations use the various loopholes to pay zero federal income tax in 2020.
Or they are people.
Moving capital gains taxes up is a big deal, right? That, in essence, is a wealth tax.
New York State is doing more than just talking about it. After Governor Cuomo last year pleaded with the rich to stay in New York.
I say, you gotta come back. When are you coming back? We'll go to dinner. I'll buy you a drink. Come over, I'll cook.
This week, the New York governor agreed to a budget slapping big new taxes on those making over $1 million. Taxes that could raise the marginal rate for the richest New Yorkers up over 52%. Only time is going to tell whether the state's 90 billionaires or 30,000 millionaires vote with their feet because of all these new taxes. But we are already seeing what using a bit of honey instead may mean, as the Chinese government plans new tax breaks on the wealthy in Hong Kong, seeking to make up for all those violent demonstrations and the political crackdown, with the result that investment managers have set up more than 100 new companies in recent months. And banks like Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, Bank of America, and Morgan Stanley are ramping up their staffing over there. None of which is to say that those of us who have benefited from the boom markets shouldn't pay our fair share, much less that we want to trade off civil liberties for tax breaks. But we do have to hope that the people making decisions keep in mind that pesky law of unintended consequences. That does it for this episode of Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. This is Bloomberg. See you next week.
Nothing beats the wisdom of the crowd. It's worked wonders for the likes of Wikipedia and Quora, and now a drone startup is bringing this crowdsourcing concept to the skies.
Well, it's called crowd droning, and it's gathering intel with unmatched precision. We'll learn how it's helping to prevent natural disasters from hitting some of the world's most vulnerable people.
And the power of prediction is also buzzing on production lines. AI algorithms are spotting early signs of wear and tear in industrial robots.
It's like a sixth sense for your machinery, and it's driving significant savings for manufacturers everywhere. More on that coming right up. Beyond Innovation starts now. An operating room is obviously the last place for fun and games. But what if I told you that a type of gaming before the operation could be the key to its success?
Well, that's the